We are back. I hope we're back for a third time. What we're going to do at this point is basically a kind of self-contained show about the Canadian elections. We caught you off mid-flow in part one. Part two, I think you never got a chance to answer the question. And now we're in part three. So we're going to start again talking about... Are you sure we're live? Because it's not live on my laptop. Oh, no, we are. Brilliant. Excellent. That was just a delay.
Once more with feeling.
Yeah. No, this one with feeling. Okay. Can you explain to me, Justin Trudeau, who he is, his 4 years in government, help our audience understand Canada's Liberal darling?
Mm-hmm. Well, I could probably do it better now that I've had a practice attempt
yeah,
anyway.
Exactly.
So this is
good.
Yeah.
Second time lucky. Well, third time lucky, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, I think most simply, and I don't think I got this into my first answer. The best way of understanding Justin Trudeau is that he is just a product of a really of a social media driven news cycle where your ability to go viral, is a major political currency. So. In 2015, especially if you saw Trudeau stories, it was always about his socks, or he dressed up as Han Solo for Halloween or something like that. But
they were his more vanilla outfits.
Yeah, that's right.
We'll get onto that later.
Yeah. But I think
the worm has turned.
but I think more specifically, Trudeau was the only liberal of that kind who, in what was a very difficult period for liberals around the world, he was able to hack the formula for how you keep the politics of the 1990s, how you keep third way liberalism going in a world where it's under assault from both left and right. And he was able to do that basically by I think channeling a version of the elite consensus in Canada while also ceding ground, rhetorically at least, to what people wanted. So there are lots of anxious people, working class, middle class people who do want a government that acts on climate change, that is interested in the redistribution of wealth, who think inequality's gone too far, who care about the rights of Indigenous peoples, who basically support a kind of social democratic policy agenda. And Trudeau was able to embrace that pretty well, at least rhetorically. I mean, I think a lot of people who voted Liberal thought that they were voting for a left of center government that was going to do those things. And after his election, that's very much how this was received in the international press, especially. David Frum wrote this article in the Atlantic, Canada lurches to the left, and he compared Trudeau to Sanders and Corbyn, which of course is absurd. But because Canada is such a small country, there's always a feedback loop with the international press. The international press, especially the American press covering Canada, is always an event unto itself.
It's like someone's noticed us.
Exactly, right. Like the American perception in particular, but more widely the international perception of Trudeau came to influence how he was perceived in Canada as well, which just amplified his, I think, false bona fides as a transformative and progressive figure. Basically he's led a pretty technocratically minded, not particularly ambitious government that I think you can see the contradictions in rhetorically embracing all these causes I mentioned, while pursuing a kind of a market-friendly, center-right agenda that doesn't antagonize too many people with wealth or power. Climate change is a really good example. The Trudeau position is, well, we're going to build the pipelines. We're actually going to be very zealous advocates for them, but we're doing so in order to generate the revenues necessary to, do a green transition or whatever. So that's an example of what the Trudeau project has been in practice, and why I think it's so utterly unconvincing.
We should go back to that climate one. I want to just first of all read out some of the promises he broke. And if you watched one of the previous streams, you might have seen this already. I'm not sure. I don't know when it cut out. But in any case, in 2015, he wasn't just the hot boxer liberal guy. He also had some serious promises in his manifesto. So he promised to implement fully and without qualification the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It would have given First Nations in Canada the right to veto natural resource development. So exactly those kind of pipelines you're talking about. Not only should that have been rejected on the grounds of climate change, but also when Trudeau was in power, indigenous communities should have been able to veto those pipelines. He ignored that once he was in power. In opposition, they opposed arms sales to Saudi Arabia. In government, they have implemented a 15 billion arms deal with the Saudis. And he said he would increase taxes on the 1%. Did that happen?
So that's an interesting story unto itself. So the answer is sort of yes and no. So they did create a new tax bracket on, I think, incomes. It's either over $200,000 or over $300,000 a year. But they also did something that they called a middle class tax cut, which the highest gain, which was a cut for the tax bracket, I guess between $89,000 and $200,000.
Oh, wow.
And so the net result was actually less income for less revenue generated through income tax. So it was a perfect kind of political sleight of hand, because they were able to cut taxes in a way that the majority of the gains went to the top 10% of earners, but raised them very slightly for the top, I guess, 1% of earners, and the net result being that there's actually less revenue collected through income tax, and so it's hardly activist government coming back, but that is how it was received.
And from what I can tell, I mean, you might be able to tell me otherwise, but the only thing that it seemed like he's actually followed through on his sort of nice liberal words is on refugee resettlement. So last year in 2018, Canada resettled more refugees than any other country. Only 28,000. It's not a huge amount, but I mean, comparatively, obviously, it's impressive for a country with that population to have resettled the absolute largest number in the world. So it seems like it's not all talk, at least on that specific issue.
Yeah,
Does he deserve credit there?
I think the government deserves some credit on that. I mean, I think that within Canada, that kind of position is a lot closer to what the political consensus already is, because multiculturalism is really a constitutive part of the Canadian identity and is, in fact, state policy. Like we have state multiculturalism as public policy in Canada.
And that's because of the Quebec issue. So you've got and I suppose First Nations people.
It dates. I think it's bigger than that.
The United States is also a country of immigrants, but they don't have a particularly generous refugee settlement policy.
Right. So if you grow up in Canadian, if you grow up going to Canadian public school, you learn that the United States is a melting pot where people are encouraged to assimilate, and that Canada is a cultural mosaic. And while that is a little reductive, there is some truth to it. In Canada, people are encouraged to preserve their identities is the notion, and there is something to that. I think the government does deserve some credit on that, but again, there's a lot they've done rhetorically that's masked places they're coming up short. So Trudeau had this famous tweet, this super viral tweet, where I think it was on the day of Trump's Muslim ban, where he tweeted something to the effect of, all are to those fleeing persecution and danger and violence, all are welcome in Canada. But of course, there was no actual change in Canada's border policy over that. Canadian authorities are still cooperating with American border services. So asylum seekers coming in, trying to come into Canada through the United States are not, there's something called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is restricting the flow of asylum seekers from the United States. So this is one of those things where, again, I suppose it could be argued that there's a value in just rhetorically challenging Donald Trump. But I think, from my point of view, Canada could be doing a lot more on this issue. And I think Trudeau's the plaudits he's won internationally is actually kind of obscuring some of the places where his government could have actually done a lot more.
Let's talk about the campaign. So the reason we're talking about Trudeau is not just because you're in the country, but also, it's a happy coincidence, really. There is a general election on Monday. Trudeau is going to be facing re-election, or is up for re-election. What's going on in that election? So I suppose we're going to talk about a particular controversy in a moment, but first of all, I want you to set the scene. So Trudeau is up against a Conservative opponent. They're who he replaced, and now you've got an insurgent Social Democratic Party, which is what's their name? The
New Democratic Party.
New Democratic Party. Shit, I should have remembered that. I have got it written down. You need a more famous Social Democratic Party, I'm afraid. So set the scene. What's at stake in Monday's election?
So there was a piece on Navarro's website that I guess it can't be more than a few days old, but I think it conveyed very well what the received wisdom about the campaign was until just a few days ago. The campaign initially looked like it was going to be a very sleepy affair, a kind of a status quo election in which the Conservatives were going to very boringly posture to try to replace the Liberals by a narrow margin. We're probably going to fail in that attempt. But also the Liberal campaign, there was not as much excitement as in 2015. They don't have a particularly bold or ambitious campaign. They're really doing a classic, defending their record after one term. And there's also this major scandal referred to kind of colloquially as the SNC-Lavalin scandal, which involves the Trudeau government having basically Trudeau himself, his office, having pressured his then Attorney General to basically let this Montreal construction giant off the hook, and then they were kind of caught out on it, and they had to change their story multiple times. It was quite embarrassing. So these were the kinds of things that were kind of swirling around, and it was looking like a very boring election, also one that was going to be potentially very difficult for the NDP, which is Canada's social democratic, historically third party, mostly third party at the national level. But in the last 7 days, to be generous about it, there does seem to be a real surge in the polls for the NDP, and it's unclear how far this is going to go. There was a poll this morning from Ipsos, which is a polling company in Canada. Conservatives at 32%. That's down 2 from the last poll. Liberals at 30, down 5. NDP 20, up 5. And then the 3 smaller parties, Greens at 8, Bloc Québécois at 7, and the People's Party, which is kind of a hard right party, sort of split off from the Conservative Party at 2%. I mean, I think if the momentum, this is a bit of an ambitious reading, but I think if the momentum continues, and I think there's every sign that it will, the NDP could actually go higher than 20%. And we could be looking at some really unpredictable results at that point. Before we started recording, I looked at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, its election poll tracker, and the seat projections are all over the place. So it's really
you've got
unclear.
a first past the post system like we have, right?
It's a first past the post system, and the voting is kind of it's very different depending on which region of the country you're in. And so no one knows what's going to happen. At this point, it seems unlikely there's going to be a majority government, so we could be back to another election, in the next few months or something like that. But it's grown very unpredictable and potentially very interesting well, I guess it wasn't a short answer, but it's the simple answer.
And the spanner in the works in the election. So he said it was looking like it was going to be a kind of dull election. Now you've got an insurgent Social Democratic Party, and Trudeau is dipping in the polls. One reason for that, and the reason that everyone in England will know about, is because a bunch of not one, but I think 3 photos of Justin Trudeau in blackface emerged online day after day after day. I think we can get those up. Apologies, because the link I've got is to the Sun, which we should in theory boycott. But
Sun and the Free Beacon in one episode.
They just had the pictures in high resolution. So can we get those pictures up?
Sorry, people of
so
Liverpool.
First of all, there was we haven't given them any money, have we? And we're not going to show the adverts.
If anything, we've stolen.
In fact, we're stealing their intellectual property. So in 2001, there is an image of him when he was a teacher in a private school wearing a turban and blackface. Then you've got one from the 1990s. He's in They Are Up. Fabulous. My WhatsApp just came up. In the 1990s, he is in blackface and an afro wig singing Deo at his school. And then there's another one from the 1990s. This is at another party. This one, he hasn't just painted his face. He's also painted his arms and his tongue. So this sort of undermined his status as a liberal, open hero, as it were. And I mean, what's more, he doesn't know how many times he's done this. He seems to have a real penchant, in fact, or seems to have had a real penchant for dressing up in blackface. Before discussing, these images and what it says about the Canadian election, we're going to go straight to the clip of his apology, if that's possible. Can we go to that now?
Darkening your face, regardless of the context or the circumstances, is always unacceptable because of the racist history of blackface. I should have understood that then, and I never should have done it. I recognize that it is something absolutely unacceptable to do. And I appreciate calling it makeup, but it was blackface. And that is just not right. It is something that people who live with the kind of discrimination that far too many people do because of the color of their skin, or their history, or their origins, or their language, or their religion, face on a regular basis. And I didn't see that from the layers of privilege that I have. And for that, I am deeply sorry, and I apologize.
You told us last night on the plane that of all of the different instances that you recalled, have you since been made aware or remembered of other instances, and if so, how many?
I am wary of being definitive about this because the recent pictures that came out, I had not remembered. And I think the question is, how can you not remember that? The fact is, I didn't understand how hurtful this is to people who live with discrimination every single day. This has been a personally a moment where I've had to reflect on the fact that wanting to do good and wanting to do better simply isn't good enough, and you need to take responsibility for mistakes that hurt people who thought I was an ally, who hopefully many of them still consider me an ally, even though this was a terrible.
Ellie, I don't know how many, kind of male feminist woke guys you've had to tolerate, but how did you take that apology? How do you think that scored? To be honest, it was quite well rehearsed, wasn't it? He did all that, I didn't realise it because I've got all this privilege. There was even a moment where he sort of corrected one of the questioners who'd said that you wore makeup, and he said, I appreciate you calling it makeup, but it was blackface. So he's sort of like schooling the questioners to show that he's now really understood what was wrong about it. What do you think?
I feel like, I can't speak to what it feels like as a person of colour to see something like that, of course. But from like a feminism point of view, I feel like every woman who is a feminist and is assertive about that has had the experience of like a man trying to be like a kind of woke male feminist, and yet usually they do say stuff like that, like that is the kind of stuff that they say. They talk in like these sort of vaulting terms about their privilege, but then they'll take you to a house party and leave you and go and get off with somebody else. That is, by the way, that didn't happen to me, but I was thinking,
like that was quite personal.
I know, but
there.
I was thinking, I am thinking of a specific man who did actually go out with a friend of mine and gave her all this spiel about gender studies and whatever, and then like literally did that to her. And
that's Trudeau, but he does it also in blackface.
Yeah, and what I was thinking like, I love 30 Rock. I think it is genuinely a hilarious TV program. I know that like
I've never seen it actually.
Well, we can debate whether like it's hilarious afterwards. I personally think it's hilarious, but it is quite dated in its politics in lots of ways. And one of the characters does wear blackface in 30 Rock, and I watch that now and I sort of cringe at that, and I think this is really not aged well. But then on the other hand, I feel like if blackface was actually acceptable in my lifetime, and that actually it was just a case that things have moved on since Justin Trudeau dressed up like that, I feel like surely I would have worn blackface at some point. I've been to Halloween parties, I've been to costume parties, but I never have. And I think, looking back on it, I think I never have, because we grew up with programs like Mind Your Language. Well, they were in the 70s. But we grew up, our generation grew up with the understanding that programs like Mind Your Language were embarrassing and dated and racist.
So that was one of those 70s sitcoms where they're all a bit
it was a program
racist about the neighbours.
Yeah, I feel reluctant to say who was in it, because just in case I accidentally malign a sort of national treasure. But like, it was a program about, I think it's about kind of Asian neighbours. And the actors in it spoke in sort of cartoonish Asian accents and wore blackface, basically. And I think, people of a certain age grew up understanding that was dated and racist. And so this idea that it was that blackface has been acceptable until relatively recently, I'm not sure that I buy that.
Well, it is weird. I mean,
Because
obviously,
I feel like I would have considered wearing it at some point if it was completely fine. But I never have, because I feel like I've always understood that is racist. You know, we've also grown up with the idea of minstrels. We've known that minstrels are racist. So I don't think the idea that blackface doesn't have, like, it's always had racist connotations, and I think for a very, very long time.
we can now let's look at Matt Lucas from 2011 on the BBC. So that's from 8 years ago. So it is.
I guess that's what I'm thinking of. You know, things like that.
Obviously, it's completely racist. But at the same time, and obviously I'm in no place to excuse Justin Trudeau, but it's a bit like that Elizabeth Warren one, where she's like speaking to the guy who's talking about gay marriage, as if, like, oh, I'm sure you can't get a girlfriend because you're against gay marriage. That was only legalised in 2013. So before 2013, to not think gay people should get married wasn't considered... I think it always was homophobic, really, to say that gay people shouldn't get married, just as it always was racist to wear blackface. But I think sometimes, as a society, we do pretend that our recent history was actually much further in the past than it in fact was.
Yeah, perhaps the thing to say is, like, there is racism that we collectively, and homophobia, and indeed sexism, that we collectively tolerate. And then there's racism, homophobia, and sexism that we deem beyond the pale. And at one point, certain things move over to the other side. But it doesn't mean that, like, I think we've always known that those things are racist, but we've always just kind of turned a blind eye to them. And then, like, eventually things change enough for us to say, well, now we can't turn a blind eye to that. But it doesn't mean that when they were being done in 2011, like in that clip, that it wasn't racist. It's just that,
it was. Yeah.
Yeah, it was racist in 2011.
It was
wasn't
racist.
as though we
Yeah.
all
Well, it's
thought it was
always
fine.
been racist, but it was societally... It wasn't exceptional, I suppose, is the point, right?
Yeah, and I suppose that's the point I'm trying to make when I say, like, I've never dressed up in blackface, and neither have lots of people, and it's not just coincidence. It's because I'm making myself sound like I'm really virtuous, but what I mean is that there has been an understanding for a long time that it's racist, but it was considered a kind of a racism that people weren't actually bothered about.
There's some interesting comments. So Jay says, Ali G, postmodern Islamophobic racism. I think lots of people look back at that thinking that was pretty racist.
Yeah, and he's like an Oxford.
Cambridge. Posh Cambridge white boy pretending to be a poor... Well, he was pretending to be a poor white guy pretending to be black, wasn't he?
Yeah, Ali G was white, but he sort of...
A starry space fox says, I mean, it's not society, it's white people. Fair enough.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Numalane says, blackface was definitely unacceptable and racist back when Justin Trudeau did it. I think we're all agreeing with that. It's whether it was exceptional or not. The voice of... In any case, I mean, he was painting his face during anti-racist struggles. That's what Alex Quack says.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, I think the reason that it's been so particularly damaging to Justin Trudeau is because he built this extremely cloying brand off a particular kind of, social justice politics, and this is kind of the ultimate. It's the ultimate proof that really was just an act. That really was just kind of performative, and he's done a bunch of other things which I think are low key. He's been racist in more subtle ways before, and they just kind of haven't been noticed. So in 2015, during the election, there was some kind of television program about where they had the leaders on to discuss. They had the three male leaders on to talk about women's issues, and there was a question about violence against women, and his answer basically made it sound like he was blaming rap music. He was saying that's the cause. He said there's a lot of misogyny in certain kinds of music or something like that. Or in this boxing match which I think was alluded to earlier. He himself has referred to that. It was a boxing match with an indigenous conservative senator, and he's referred to that. I think it was in his Rolling Stone interview, when he was on the cover of Rolling Stone a couple of years ago. And I mean, he basically says, we thought this sent the right message. We thought the implication being that, me, a white settler, white patrician settler, beating up this indigenous man, is good branding. And people have always kind of ignored this when it comes from him, because his brand has always been kind of too big to fail. People are too emotionally and politically invested in it. And I think it's extraordinary, even in that answer that he gave that you just played, where he's apologizing for doing blackface multiple times and saying that he can't even put a figure on it. He still manages to quite adeptly make the whole thing about himself. As you pointed out, he corrects the reporter, and this is, if Trudeau has any real political skill, it's that he can turn even something like this. He can kind of absorb it back into his brand. Although I do think this has potentially damaged his image irreparably, and I think that is probably one of the causes of the NDP surge that's going on right now. Although I think there are others, and we should probably talk about those too.
Yeah, let's talk about the NDP. So they've got a new leader, Jagmeet Singh.
Jagmeet Singh.
I thought, I read on his Twitter, he said it's pronounced Hugmeet. But I mean, you've obviously heard it said on the television more than me, so Jagmeet.
But then football commentators do call Jose Mourinho Jose Mourinho.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to take your version. Even though that is how he phonetically described it in his Twitter bio. In any case, can you explain to us the leader of the New Democratic Party and why you think he is surging in the polls? We're also going to show a clip in a moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so I think that Canada's hard to, people often ask me, like, so is the NDP like Bernie Sanders, or is it like the Labour Party? And the answer is kind of no, in that I don't think in Canada we don't have this kind of same populist energy that exists in some other countries. We don't really have, but we do have I think pretty ideologically committed form of social democracy, and his leadership, I think, has really moved the party in that direction. It's moved it to the left, and there is a pretty solid social democratic agenda that's being campaigned on. He's also talked about the need to decriminalize drugs and end the drug war, which is a pretty bold thing to do. And I think that I think he's been very well received. He had a very low visibility before the campaign. He's had much higher visibility. There's been a lot of racism directed at him, and he's dealt with it extraordinarily well. So there was an incident a few weeks ago when he was campaigning in a marketplace in Montreal, and a man came up to him and said, you should take off your turban so that you look Canadian. So there have been a lot of incidents like that.
What was his response?
He just sort of politely. He really did hold his own, and he just kind of politely pushed back. And he said, somebody defective in Canada, being Canadian means you can wear whatever you want. And there was I think the one and perhaps only televised debate last week, and I think most of the press gallery agreed that it was kind of his night. He did very well. So I think. If you ask the average pundit in Canada why there's an NDP surge, I think it would kind of stop there. My own reading is that the NDP platform is also very popular, and that the Liberal victory in 2015, as cynical as I am personally about it, and as disingenuous as I found a lot of their rhetoric, the fact was it was effective because people thought they were voting for something like a kind of social democratic agenda. And so now, after 4 years, people realizing you're not going to get that under Justin Trudeau, there's a possibility that we could get it with the NDP, and I think people are actually pretty excited by that possibility. So we'll have to see how far the surge goes.
That's when I asked for a clip from you to sort of demonstrate how he presents himself and why he's been effective and why he's inspired people. You showed me this one of him talking about getting water to communities in the First Nations. I've actually just checked up why my pronunciation mistake came about. His Twitter bio is Jug like hug meat, and I thought the hug was referring to the whole of the JUG, but it was only referring to the UG. Mm-hmm. So this is Jagmeet Singh answering a question about a plan to fund pipelines for clean water to First Nations in Canada. Can we get that clip up now?
Are you just writing a blank check for all problems for all Indigenous communities across the country once you get into office?
So if Toronto had a drinking water problem, if Montreal had a drinking water problem, would you be asking the same question?
It's a lot of money, is what I'm saying, and people will look at it and go, how much money are we going to spend on all this, and how are you going to find that money?
That's a genuine question. Would you be asking this question if Vancouver did not have clean drinking water? Would you be asking this question if Edmonton did not have clean drinking water? No, you wouldn't. And that's what I'm saying. Why is it that we ask the question about whether or not Indigenous people should have clean drinking water? We got to take a minute and think, why is that even a question? Yes, they deserve clean drinking water. Yes, we can make it happen. It's a matter of priority, and I'm going to do it.
A politician shifting the debate by there saying it's going to cost, how much was it, 1.8 billion? How much was they saying? It's going to cost X number of billion to give, or for the state to provide, clean drinking water to various Indigenous communities in northern Canada. And the question was, are we going to be able to afford this? How much is it really going to cost? And the answer is, look, would you even ask that question if it was about Toronto, if it was about Montreal? And it's, it completely flawed the questioner, because you wouldn't. Mm-hmm. There would not be a question if in London, for example, a whole borough didn't, well, it depends, I suppose we can talk about racism and economic inequality in London. It might depend on what borough you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But if you're talking about Westminster or Islington, then there isn't going to be a price limit on getting that area water. And I suppose, is he shifting the debate in Canada? Also, I mean, another question, how live is this issue of the rights of Indigenous people and First Nation Canadians in a general election?
I mean, it's a very significant issue, I think. Partly because there's a lot of just visible urgency around it, but also because in 2015 the Liberals campaigned pretty hard as they were going to get serious on Indigenous rights, and the Conservative government that preceded them was certainly not serious on them. So I think it has some added resonance because a lot of Indigenous people voted Liberal in 2015, and they didn't get the kind of government they thought they were gonna get. And so I think that answer was really just channeling that. There's a lot of smugness in Canada, and I've written about this before. The Canadian identity around kind of multiculturalism and diversity and things like that. That has much to commend it, but one of the things it often functions to do is it convinces people that as long as a politician's talking about Indigenous rights, for example, that means everything's fine. Canada's a multicultural country. These problems aren't very serious. The elites are looking into it. Everything's going to be fine. And that's just not the case. I mean, there are people in Canada that do not have clean drinking water. And as Jagmeet Singh says in that answer, if that was Montreal or Toronto, that just wouldn't be happening.
And so, I mean, we'll go to questions in a moment. But first of all, let's talk about potential outcomes. So it seems like if there is a surge for the NDP, then could it be the case, is a possible or even likely outcome that you have Trudeau re-elected as the leader of the party with the most seats, but in a coalition with the NDP? And would that be a real progressive moment for Canada?
It's possible. So Singh has said that he's open to a coalition government, and I don't think Trudeau has ruled it out yet. I had my reading of the NDP posturing that way was actually that it was designed to force the Liberals to reject the idea. I'm not sure if that's the case or not. But that is a possible outcome. I mean, it's very difficult to know how the seats are going to break down. I think we could end up having an election very soon, another election. It seems hard to imagine any party having a majority of seats. And so things have become really volatile and unpredictable at this point. And I guess it's Tuesday, right? So there's less than a week to go. But if the NDP momentum continues and there's a point before the end of the campaign that the polls, that the Liberals and the NDP has leapfrogged the Liberals and they're in second place, the Liberals will then start to lose a lot more votes because there are a lot of people in Canada that will basically vote for whatever the non-conservative option is, which is one of the things that's always served the Liberals very well. And that, might still happen in this election. But if the NDP momentum continues, the outcome could be really extraordinary, and then we'll just have to see what happens. I'm somewhat wary of making predictions given how volatile the whole thing is.
Would it be a good idea? Someone's asked this in the comments as well. Would it be a good idea to go into coalition with Trudeau if you're a member of the NDP?
I think if the NDP were to do that, there would have to be some really clear. The coalition would have to have. There'd be first a question of is it actually a coalition government? Are there NDP cabinet ministers? I'd have to think more about that. My instinct is to say that might not be advisable, but it could also be some kind of formal accord where the NDP says, "We'll give you the confidence of the House for X amount of time, provided you you implement this agenda along with us, which we'll vote for. And I think the terms of that would have to be pretty strict. The Liberals should not be allowed to stay in power unless they're going to, reverse on a lot of their, I mean, they need to raise rich people's taxes. They need to change the electoral system. They need to cancel pipelines. They need to build affordable housing. They need to extend Medicare to include pharmaceutical drugs, dental care, mental health care. There's a lot they need to do. And I think the price of the NDP's support should certainly be very, very high.
Let's very quickly go to questions, and we're going to do these quick fire because I think actually the sound and vision, if the comments are correct, somewhat gone out of sync. Oh, no. And as the stream has already gone down 3 times this evening, let's not try our luck. But if you've got any questions, now is your chance because we are going to end this stream in about 5 minutes, I reckon. So if you've got any desperate ones, put them in now. Whilst you're doing that, we are about to move studio. We will have better internet in that new studio, which means that streams will go down less. Hopefully never. I still don't understand why sometimes at the end of streams our mouths start moving at a different pace to the audio. I think that's probably because we need an upgrade of our software, and the way we upgrade our software is a bit more money. So please go to support.novaramedia.com. And people are saying the sync is fine. It was just the problem with someone else's laptop. So, I mean, still give us some money. Sync is perfect. That's great. In any case, give us... I'm very pleased about that. Give us some questions. People are asking whether other people are still in the old chat. When will Michael and US Nation get a TV studio? Michael and Us Nation.
That's my podcast.
Oh,
incredible.
Sick. You're in a different continent.
I am, yeah.
So I don't know how that would work. Yeah, plug your podcast while I'm collecting questions.
That was your mum.
So yeah, Michael and Us. Well, that's a podcast I do with a fellow called Will Sloan, who's a longtime friend and colleague of mine.
Sorry, I thought the Michael was me. That's why I was confused.
Yeah, it makes sense. I wasn't sure at first what the question was.
Yeah.
But so Will and I met in student journalism, and maybe 11 or 12 years ago when we met, we for some reason had a lot of conversations about the documentary filmmaker Michael Moore, who I guess in the early 2000s was kind of formative for both of us. So we started this. I love Michael Moore. We started this kind of vanity project, kind of ironically watch all of Michael Moore's filmography again and look at it through the lens of current events. And it turned out there was a lot of material to mine because a lot of his films, I mean, some of them hold up. Some of them suffer from a lot of limitations that liberalism, I think, continues to suffer from. And so then that led us to going through kind of season 2 was going through all of the sort of bargain basement conservative documentaries that were anti-Michael Moore because they were really scared of him in 2003, 2004.
You would call him a liberal?
I would say it's complicated. But
I feel like a liberal would never have made capitalism a love story.
His films have I mean the audience for his films is pretty diverse. He's I think often his politics are better than is sometimes conveyed in his films. I've quite warmed to him in the last few years again because I think he's been on the right side of a lot of issues and he's been very perceptive about some things. But of course, we eventually exhausted the Michael Moore thing, and so now it's sort of just a general politics, current affairs show where often the centerpiece is a piece of cultural paraphernalia, sometimes from the earlier mid 2000s. So I'm delighted that a Michael and Us fan is well,
there's more than one. A also asks, has Michael and Us considered doing any Adam Curtis docs?
Yes, we have.
And Joseph O says, this is a question, but then also it has a big up. Have green issues been a prominent issue in the election after the pipeline scandal? Also big up Michael and Us Nation. That's from Joseph O.
Wow. Yes, green issues have been.
Do you want to expand? I suppose I said it was quickfire. That was quickfire. Yeah. That's good. But I mean, they're not surging in the polls, are they?
Oh well, the Green Party is a whole other story, and I mean a sort of something I could have mentioned when I was introducing the election is that the Green Party was actually looked like they're on course to do pretty well, and even in certain scenarios maybe overtake the NDP. And the Green Party in Canada is a little bit strange. It all kinds of people run for it. It's sort of an ideologically catch-all party. I mean, my understanding of the UK Green Party is that it's generally been pretty firmly left of center. I don't know if that's sounds accurate to the two of you, but Canada's Green Party is not really like that. It's very much a sort of personality vehicle around the leader, Elizabeth May.
Ours is a bit of a personality vehicle,
Yeah, I was
actually.
really like,
Caroline Lucas.
But
Yeah,
that
yeah.
kind of happened by accident, just because they only had one MP, so there was
Right.
sort of no choice.
Right. So,
I don't blame her, really.
yeah.
Yeah, she's great as well. I think
Yeah.
she's made some missteps over Brexit recently, but like generally she's been brilliant.
Yeah. But so, yeah, Canada's Green Party is a little weird, and they usually poll better during elections than they do on election day, and all indications, I think, are that's going to happen again.
Max Shanley has a question, and he's being
Oh,
very
hey,
persistent
Max.
with it.
Hi, Max.
And it's probably good, but it's one of those questions where I don't understand it, so I'm just going to have to read it
Okay, I'm
blind.
scared
Is
now.
it about the Labour Party rule book? Because that would be a very Max question to ask.
I don't think you're going to know what it means either.
No, okay.
You
Let's
might do.
let's give it a
I
go.
think it's Canada specific. So Max Shanley asks, can Luke talk about the waffle
Oh,
and
I'd
how
love
its
to.
defeat stunted the development of the NDP?
It's a really interesting question. So the Waffle was the kind of left faction that was involved in the NDP in the early 70s, and at one point it commanded something like a third of support, possibly more, at an NDP convention. The Waffle was a sort of new left movement, I suppose, in some ways analogous to the Benites, although I suppose they came later. They were kind of peaking in the 1980s. But they were, all kinds of things came together. A much more radical kind of socialist economic agenda, and also, a lot of kind of anti-war sentiment and things like that. The Waffle, though, was also heavily premised on a kind of economic nationalism, which I confess, and this will disappoint Max, but I don't think I've done enough critical reading on the Waffle. I'm very sympathetic to it. I don't think I've done enough critical reading on the Waffle's nationalism. There are people who will argue that nationalism was a limitation rather than a strength. Nationalism in Canada has somewhat of a different connotation because it was nationalism that was resisting, American capitalism. So it was a left nationalism. But certainly there was a lot of populist energy in the Waffle, and when that was gone, I do think the NDP suffered to reclaim it somewhat. I'd love to talk to Max in more detail off mic about the Waffle sometime.
Ellie, any opinions on the Waffle now you know what it is? I haven't formed any in that period
No,
of time
I
either.
was just thinking I like waffles.
Yeah, waffles in general.
Waffles are delicious. And in the US they have chicken and waffles, and it's
Fucked up.
no, it's incredible. For breakfast, I had it for breakfast when I was there once.
Let's end it there. I want to get another beer. I want to open the window. I want to do a little troubleshooting, work out what's going on with our technology. But thank you as ever for watching TyksySour. Thank you, Luke Savage. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks.
Ellie Mae O'Hagan, it is always a pleasure.
Why don't you invite me on this more often, Mike?
Okay, we'll do. Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Great.
I'll book you in.
Excellent.
We're actually going to, speaking of that, we are going to be upping the regularity of these podcasts as these tumultuous times speed up. I'm pretty sure we're going to do a podcast probably on Friday, depending on what has been agreed at this EU summit, or if sometime towards the end of the week. Follow us on Twitter. The next feed we do will last the whole time. It'll be in sync. It'll be absolutely beautiful. But yeah, thank you for watching. Good night. Thank you both. You've been watching
Cheers.
TyksySour.